cunts. Sorry about that, rather abrupt opening. About as subtle as River Song's sexual references though. But the people who decided to neglect so fucking much of 60s Doctor Who are the biggest collection of bellends since Nigel Farage invited the Kardashians round for tea with Chris Brown and Nicki Minaj. The dumping period has sadly seen 97 episodes of Doctor Who still being lost or destroyed. Back in the 60s there was no such thing as Sky Plus with recording. Hell, there wasn't even such a thing as VHS, so when TV companies aired their episodes with the film reels, the reels either ended up in storage or just in the bin. The BBC could obviously only store so many canisters in their warehouses, and so many episodes of classic TV shows including Dad's Army and The Avengers were binned in order to make space for more recent canisters. Another big problem comes from the film itself, which is highly flammable, and so there have been hundreds of cases of film storage depots burning down over the years. Sadly, this has to be the case, and it's very unlikely we'll ever be as lucky to get something like the Enemy of the World and the Web of Fear cases again. In the meantime, all we can do is wonder. So fasten your seatbelt, open your mind, and try not to set light to anything else for ConManWho's Top 5 Lost Doctor Who Stories I Want to Be Found. Number 5. Fury from the Deep. Stu Bagfull will even tell you about this one. What we have here is possibly the scariest episode of Doctor Who ever made, yes, even scarier than Blink, that sadly can never be seen. There have been some brilliant recons of this story, and luckily many stills from the production still exist, and the surviving audio is so spine-tinglingly terrifying that it still has an effect. Just not as much of an effect, sadly. Specific hats go off to Bill Burridge, who plays Mr. Quill, who gets the award for the most terrifying facial expression in Doctor Who history. Though a special shout out to Sharon Duncan Brewster for The Waters of Mars. That shit still haunts me, I mean, look at that. Anyway, Fury is a very tight story, and from what stills we have and what very little footage we have, then the direction is probably the sorest loss from this story. I can imagine it looking absolutely beautiful, and it's a shame when something that has clearly had so much hard work put into it just ceases to exist. Number 4. Marco Polo. Now, I don't think that Marco Polo is anywhere near the strongest story that could be found, in terms of the actual story. There's some lost stories that I haven't put on the list that I'd much rather watch and enjoy more than Marco Polo, but this one's got to be on the list because of its relevance. Because of it being lost, we have an incomplete Season 1. I mean, yeah, there's the missing episodes from the Reign of Terror as well, so if all of Marco Polo were to be found, there'd still be an incomplete Season 1 either way. But at least we'd have something from each story. Marco Polo doesn't have a sausage apart from its stills. I do think it's a pretty good story, and the Hartnell era always did historical stories well in my opinion, regardless of if the plot was a bit loose, so I think that Marco Polo would be a very important story to have returned to us. Number 3. Episode 4 of the 10th Planet. Yeah, I've gotcha. This one isn't a lost story per se, but this episode is quite possibly the most important Doctor Who episode in history. Doctor Who has only survived as long as it has because of the innovative idea of regeneration which spawns from this episode. Granted, we luckily have the first Doctor's regeneration scene intact, but we don't truly have the pleasure of seeing William Hartnell's final performance, or of being able to see the Doctor's gradual weakening into wearing a bit thin. Hartnell was getting progressively weaker as an actor with his arteriosclerosis, which is where your arteries harden up and restrict blood flow, which in turn restricts blood flowing to the brain and leads to what I like to call Hartnellisms of William Hartnell forgetting or botching his lines. Regardless of that, however, Hartnell was always a great visual performer and he had some very good control over his facial expressions, especially in his goodbye scenes to Susan and Ian and Barbara. With this in mind, it's such a shame we can't properly see the effort he'd have put into this final episode. Number 2. The Daleks' Master Plan. If you're someone like me who considers the Daleks' master plan as the longest story ever made, and not thinking of the trial of a Time Lord as one story, but rather 4 separate intertwining stories, then surely that's a good reason to have this story back. Except it isn't, because there's so much more to the Daleks' master plan than simply it's a long epic adventure. Firstly, it's the only incomplete Dalek story from the Hartnell era, and that hurts based on how much I love the others. Yep, even the chase, which does have a bit of a negative connotation about it, but I absolutely adore it for some reason. The monster I think of the most when I think of the Hartnell era is the Daleks, and it's a shame we only have a handful of episodes from their final First Doctor outing, as well as their best. Basically, the Daleks want to take over the universe, and yes, that plot does deserve the preface, basically, but it's the characters and the way the plot progresses that's fantastic. Because the Daleks' master plan is such a ballsy adventure, and has some incredibly bleak shit in it for a 60s children's show. Like there's Katerina, who's being set up as the replacement for Vicky, who swapped places in the previous story, The Mythmakers, and she is fairly likeable, more so than Dodo at least, and she's given a couple of episodes to blossom as a character, until she's killed. And not just killed, she's killed in a really horrific way. So yeah, there's that, but there's also some standout performances. Nicholas Courtney plays Brett Vian before he would go on to play the Brigadier, and it looks like he's having a lot of fun as a kind of good guy, kind of bad guy character. His performance as the brigade leader in Inferno clearly showed that Courtney had a good range as an actor. Then there's Jean Marsh, who also plays a sort of goody, sort of baddie Sarah Kingdom, who was popular enough to get 5 companion chronicle stories set during the Daleks' master plan, which if you bundle them in, would make the Daleks' master plan 22 parts long. Kevin Stoney gives a great performance as the Guardian of the Solar System, Mavic Chen. He just relishes in playing villains and would go on to play the exquisite Tobias Vaughan in The Invasion. And of course, the regular cast are great as always. The scale of this story is epic, and it just keeps on throwing stuff at you, and it builds to the climax, which is quite possibly the most adverse Doctor Who moment in history, to the point where it's actually depressing. This story is just fucking gold. Number 1. The Power of the Daleks. I think the reason for this getting number 1 is pretty obvious. Patrick Troughton is such a great Doctor. His dedication and love for the show really stands out amongst the other Doctors. He had the burden on his shoulders of guiding Doctor Who into a new light and taking over a very popular role from a very popular actor, and he achieved it seamlessly. After his run, he'd returned to the show 3 times, which is more than any other Doctor in terms of TV. I mean, come on, he died at a Doctor Who convention. The man's literal last hours were spent welcoming and meeting his fans, and fans of the show alike. With this, it's just bloody painful for us to not have Troughton's introductory story. He's the only Doctor to not have a surviving first story, so we don't have the privilege of seeing Troughton's first moments of taking on the role. Other than Troughton, though, we also don't get to see the other most important Doctor Who episode ever. I said that episode 4 of The 10th Planet was 1 because it was the end of the first era and transmitted the first regeneration to viewers, which is the concept that has allowed Doctor Who to last for over 5 decades, but The Power of the Daleks was the story that picked up the ball and made viewers see the direction the show was going in. At this point in time, Doctor Who really must have been up in the air, so the success of this story and Troughton's performance were crucial. Other than the symbolic aspects of this story though, and its relevance, Power has a brilliant plot. Basically, the TARDIS crew lands on an Earth colony and discovers that a scientist has found 2 damaged Daleks in a crashed spaceship and is trying to revive them. The Doctor is mistaken for an official examiner from Earth, and he tries to warn the colony about how dangerous the Daleks really are. In conclusion, for both symbolic and historical reasons, and for the reason that this story is very, very good, then The Power of the Daleks takes my number 1 spot.